You're in the middle of a conversation. Someone is talking. And somewhere between their second sentence and their third, your brain has quietly left the building. Not because you're rude, not because you're tired, because something they said triggered a connection your mind needed to follow. And it followed it, 6 layers deep, without asking for permission. You come back a few seconds later, nodding, hoping the expression on your face has been doing its job while you were away. That's not distraction. That's pattern 1. Science has a name for it, and it shows up in research on high IQ individuals more than almost anywhere else. A study out of the Georgia Institute of Technology found that people with highly efficient brains have so much spare cognitive capacity that their minds wander almost involuntarily. Psychology professor Eric Schumacher described it this way: when a brain has too much processing power for the current task, it doesn't sit idle. It wanders. It explores. It solves problems it hasn't been consciously assigned yet. Researchers call this spontaneous cognition, which is a very clinical way of saying your brain is running a background program that nobody else in the room can see. What looks like spacing out is actually your nervous system doing its most creative, most integrative thinking. The problem is, it happens everywhere. Mid-sentence, mid-meeting, at the exact moment someone asks if you were listening. You just weren't only listening. Number 2. You are late more often than your intelligence should logically allow. You sat down to do one thing. You looked up and an hour and 40 minutes had evaporated. Not because you got distracted in the lazy sense, but because your brain entered a state of focus so complete that the part responsible for tracking external time simply stopped reporting. Neuroscientists call this temporal dissociation, what happens when deep cognitive engagement overrides your brain's normal timekeeping function. For high IQ individuals, this isn't occasional, it's structural. Their internal clock was never calibrated for the ordinary pace of things. It runs fast when they're bored and disappears entirely when they're absorbed. So they chronically underestimate how long things take, miss transitions, arrive slightly breathless and genuinely confused about where the time went. People read it as disorganization. It isn't. It's what happens when a brain built for depth keeps losing track of the surface. Number 3. You find certain things darkly funny that nobody else in the room finds funny at all, and you didn't choose to find them funny. The humor arrived involuntarily, at the worst possible moment, in the most inappropriate possible setting, and all you could do was try to keep your face completely neutral while your shoulders started making their own decisions. A study published in Cognitive Processing found that people who both appreciate and produce dark humor score significantly higher on verbal intelligence and emotional stability. Here's what's actually happening. Finding something darkly funny requires your brain to hold 2 contradictory realities simultaneously and locate the collision point between them, the tragic and the absurd, occupying the same space at the same time. Psychologists call this cognitive bissociation. Most people's brains process one emotional register at a time. Yours is running 2 in parallel and finding the gap between them funny before you've consciously decided to. The blank stares aren't about a missing sense of humor, they're about processing speed. Number 4. You were told you had ADHD, anxiety, or some other diagnosis that never quite fit. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you always knew something was slightly off about the label. A survey of Mensa members found substantially elevated rates of ADHD diagnoses, autism spectrum disorder, and anxiety disorders compared to the general population. But here's what the research also found. Many of those diagnoses were applied to behaviors that were actually symptoms of something else entirely, a gifted brain in an environment that wasn't built for it. Boredom in an unchallenging classroom looks identical to inattention on a behavioral checklist. A mind that thinks in too many directions at once looks like distractibility to someone who doesn't know what they're looking at. Researchers call this educational misalignment, where the problem isn't the brain, but the mismatch between the brain and its container. That child who couldn't sit still, who kept asking questions that derailed the lesson, who seemed like too much. They didn't have a deficit, they had a surplus, and nobody in the room had the right measuring tool. Number 5. You are exceptionally good at spotting other people's flawed reasoning, and almost completely blind to your own. You can identify the logical gap in someone's argument before they've finished making it. You can see the bias in a study, the flaw in a plan, the motivated reasoning underneath someone's very confident conclusion. And you are correct. You are genuinely, measurably better at this than most people in the room. What the research also found, and this is the part nobody puts on the poster, is that higher cognitive ability correlates with a significantly larger bias blind spot toward yourself. A 2012 study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology tested participants across 7 different cognitive biases. In 6 of the 7, the more cognitively sophisticated participants showed larger blind spots about their own flawed reasoning than average. Researchers West, Meserve, and Stanovich called this the bias blind spot. And the sharper your mind, the wider it appears to be. The explanation is quietly brutal. The same intelligence that lets you dismantle someone else's argument also makes you extraordinarily good at constructing elaborate justifications for your own. You don't just hold a biased position. You build a very convincing architecture around it. And because the construction is sophisticated, it feels like reasoning. It feels like arriving at a conclusion through careful thought, when sometimes it's actually the conclusion you already wanted, dressed in better clothes than anyone else could have managed. Number 6. You arrive at the right answer and then cannot fully explain how you got there. The conclusion came before the argument. You knew before you could show your work. And when someone asks you to walk them through your reasoning, you build the path backward, reconstructing a route you didn't actually take consciously to get where you already are. Neuroimaging studies show that high IQ brains don't simply process faster. They route information through alternate neural pathways, taking roads that don't appear on the standard map. This is why gifted individuals often struggle to teach what they know. The knowing arrived through a channel that didn't log the journey. Psychologists call this implicit cognition, understanding that forms below the threshold of conscious reasoning. The result is a person who is frequently right, occasionally cannot prove it, and finds the requirement to do so faintly exhausting. It looks like arrogance from the outside. From the inside, it feels more like trying to describe a color to someone who keeps asking you to name the wavelength. Number 7. You are more generous than average, and the reason is not entirely what you think it is. Research involving 301 participants in controlled economic experiments found that people who scored higher on intelligence tests consistently behaved more generously. But the explanation researchers landed on wasn't moral, it was strategic. High IQ individuals are statistically better equipped to rebuild resources after giving them away. They have stronger problem-solving capacity, higher future earning potential, broader social networks, which means generosity is genuinely less costly to them in the long run. Economists call this rational altruism. Your giving is real, your compassion is real, but underneath it, running quietly, is a brain that calculated the risk before you consciously decided anything and determined that giving was the move that made sense, which is somehow both beautiful and slightly unsettling. Mostly because it means your generosity and your strategy have been sharing office space this entire time, and you never got the memo. Number 8. You walk into a room and immediately feel something that nobody else seems to feel. A tension between two people that hasn't been spoken yet. A decision that's already been made but hasn't been announced. A mood underneath the mood that everyone is performing on top of. And you feel it before you have any logical reason to. What's happening is not intuition in the mystical sense. Polish researcher Kazimierz Dabrowski, who spent decades studying gifted individuals, identified what he called emotional overexcitability, a measurably heightened moral and emotional sensitivity found disproportionately in people with extremely high intelligence. Their ethical radar doesn't just detect their own moral landscape, it scans the room. It picks up on injustice, inauthenticity, and unspoken tension the way other people pick up on obvious stated facts. The weight of this is real, because seeing the moral dimension of situations nobody else is treating as moral means carrying a concern that nobody else seems to share. You're not overthinking. You're receiving a frequency the room isn't broadcasting on, and you can't turn the receiver off. Number 9. You have experienced a specific kind of depression that arrived without anything going wrong. No loss, no failure, no identifiable trigger. Just a heaviness that settled in somewhere between a Wednesday and a Thursday and seemed to be generated entirely from the inside. Psychologist Dabrowski wrote about this extensively. He called it existential depression, and he found it occurred disproportionately in gifted individuals, not as a response to events, but as a natural consequence of awareness itself. Research published through the Davidson Institute found that the same cognitive tools enabling exceptional thinking, the analytical depth, the foresight, the pattern recognition, create perfect conditions for a particular kind of despair. When your brain is wired to see complexity, mortality, meaninglessness, and the gap between how the world is and how it could be, it does not need a reason to feel the weight of those things. It finds them on a Tuesday, without warning, without cause. What most people would need a crisis to access, you can arrive at through an ordinary afternoon. That's not weakness. That's what happens when a mind built for depth turns its full attention on existence. Number 10. You were too much. Too curious, too intense, too sensitive, too loud, too quiet, too in your own head, too everything in rooms that were only built to hold average. Research on gifted children shows they are labeled difficult, disruptive, and emotionally unstable at significantly higher rates than their peers. Not because something is wrong with them, but because their intensity exceeds what a standard environment was designed to contain. And here's what nobody talks about. Those labels don't stay in childhood. They follow. They become the internal voice that says, dial it back, be less, take up less space, stop making people uncomfortable with how much you feel, and how fast you think, and how deeply you care about things that everyone else seems perfectly fine treating as surface level. But here's the thing that the research keeps finding underneath all of it. The intensity that made you too much as a child is the same intensity behind every pattern in this video. The daydreaming, the time blindness, the dark humor, the misdiagnosis, the bias blind spot, the inexplicable knowing, the rational generosity, the moral weight, the existential heaviness. All of it comes from the same place. A mind that was never built to operate at the level everyone else considered normal. You were never too much. You were just in the wrong room. And if this video felt less like information and more like someone reading something back to you that you've never said out loud, subscribe. Tell me in the comments which one hit closest to home. I read them all. See you in the next one.